For centuries, archaeologists believed they had a clear understanding of how the ancient world was built. But every year, new discoveries continue to challenge that picture. Across mountains, deserts, jungles, and forgotten ruins, researchers have uncovered enormous structures, impossible stonework, and mysterious sites that raise more questions than answers. Some appear far too advanced for their time. Others don't resemble anything else ever built by the civilizations they're attributed to. In this documentary, we'll travel across the world to explore some of the most extraordinary ancient discoveries ever found, each one revealing a different piece of history that still puzzles experts today. Chapter 1: Kuelap. High above the cloud forests of northern Peru stands a structure that should not exist. Its walls rise nearly 20 meters into the air. Its defenses stretch across an entire mountain ridge. And for centuries, thousands of people lived behind those walls. It is one of the largest fortresses ever built in the Americas, and almost nobody has heard of it. That silence is itself the first mystery. Mainstream archaeology has an answer for Kuelap. The Chachapoya people built it, beginning sometime around 900 AD, using the same stone tools and manual labor that produced every other ancient monument in the Andes. A mountain people in a remote region building for defense. The explanation is clean. The explanation is confident. And then you look at the walls, because there is a measurement that the textbooks do not linger on. The outer platform of Kuelap contains an estimated 111,000 cubic meters of stone. That figure is not a guess. It comes from careful architectural survey. And when researchers ran the numbers, what came back was extraordinary. The volume of stone used to build Kuelap is nearly 4 times the volume of stone in the Great Pyramid of Giza. The Great Pyramid required an estimated 20 years and tens of thousands of workers. It is considered one of the supreme feats of organized labor in human history. And the people the textbooks describe as scattered mountain villagers, isolated in the cloud forest with no written language and no empire behind them, somehow moved 4 times that amount of stone onto a ridge more than 3,000 meters above sea level. Think about what that requires in practical terms. Every stone had to be quarried from the mountain. Every stone had to be moved, without wheels, without draft animals suited to that altitude, without roads of the kind the Inca would later build. Every worker had to be fed, on a ridge with no broad valley below, no major river, no obvious agricultural base capable of sustaining a construction workforce that size. Even today, reaching Kuelap requires a long climb through some of the most rugged terrain in Peru. The easy answer is that it simply took a very long time. Generations of slow, patient work adding up to something vast. Except the walls are not the product of slow and patient accumulation. They are continuous, uniform, built to a consistent height and thickness across hundreds of meters. That is not the fingerprint of casual generational effort. That is the fingerprint of organized, sustained, large-scale construction. The kind that requires a central authority capable of directing thousands of workers across decades. And no such authority in the Chachapoya homeland has ever been found. No palace, no capital city, no royal road network, no administrative center of the kind that always appears when a society operates at this scale. Only the fortress, standing alone above the clouds, surrounded by silence, built by a people history has almost entirely forgotten. Which leaves a question that the textbooks have never fully answered. If the Chachapoya were capable of this, what were they afraid of? And does the answer to that question explain why they built their city so high, so remote, and so impossible to reach? That is where this investigation begins. The most surprising thing about Kuelap is not the walls. It is the people who built them. And to understand who they were, you need to stand at the edge of a cliff in the cloud forest and look up. Because that is where the Chachapoya buried their dead. Carved into vertical cliff faces, hundreds of meters above the valley floor, in locations that appear physically unreachable today, stand figures carved from plaster and wood. Human-shaped sarcophagi. Bodies sealed inside forms built to look like standing people, arms crossed, heads tilted slightly forward. Staring out over the valley from ledges no modern climber has been able to reach without equipment the Chachapoya did not have. Archaeologists have spent years trying to understand how they got there. The honest answer is that we still don't fully know. What we do know is this: A civilization that buries its dead in the most inaccessible places on the mountain is not a civilization that thinks about the world the way most people do. Height meant something to the Chachapoya. Verticality meant something. The relationship between the living below and the dead above was not accidental. It was engineered. And that word, engineered, is the one that keeps returning when you study this people. Ask someone to name an ancient Peruvian civilization and the answer is almost always the Inca. That is understandable. The Inca left roads, temples, cities. An empire stretching 6,000 kilometers. A machine so large and so efficient that it absorbed dozens of smaller societies almost without leaving a mark of the transition. The Chachapoya were supposed to be one of those absorbed societies. When the Inca finally entered the cloud forests, and it took them longer than it took to conquer almost anyone else, they found a people who did not behave like a conquered population was supposed to behave. The Chachapoya rebelled. Repeatedly, the Inca returned. Repeatedly, Spanish chronicles record the region as one of the most persistently resistant territories in the entire empire. Then the Spanish arrived. And something happened that almost never happened anywhere in the Andes. The Chachapoya allied with them. Not reluctantly, not under coercion. A significant faction of the Chachapoya actively chose the Spanish over the Inca, the empire that had ruled them, forcibly relocated entire communities of them, and spent decades trying to break them. Think about what that decision reveals. After everything the Spanish represented, disease, violence, the destruction of every familiar institution, the Chachapoya apparently considered Inca rule worse. That is not the behavior of a small, frightened mountain people grateful to survive under any authority offered to them. That is the behavior of a people with a long memory. A people who remembered what they had been before the Inca arrived. And what they had been was something the historical record has only begun to recover. Because the Chachapoya left almost no written record. The documentation that survived came almost entirely from their enemies. Inca oral histories and Spanish chronicles. Neither of them neutral, neither of them interested in preserving the Chachapoya's version of their own story. There are 3 ways into Kuelap. Not 1, 3. And the people who designed them understood something about violence that most architects never have to think about. Stand at the main entrance today and the first impression is almost disappointing. A stone gateway, walls on either side, an opening leading into the fortress. Nothing that immediately signals danger. Then you walk forward. The walls begin to rise. The passage begins to narrow. By the time you reach the tightest point, the opening is wide enough for one person. 1. Not 2 walking side by side. Not a small group moving together. One human body, moving forward alone, with walls of full fortress height pressing in from both sides and no view of what lies ahead. Now imagine you are not a tourist. Imagine you are a warrior. You have climbed this mountain. You have reached the walls. You have found the entrance. And now the architecture is doing something to you that no amount of training or numbers can overcome. It is separating you from everyone behind you. But the narrowing passage is not the strangest thing about these entrances. The strangest thing is what lies beneath one of them. Archaeological survey of the main entrance revealed a section of flooring that was not solid. A false floor, constructed to appear identical to the surrounding stone, positioned at the point in the passage where an attacker would have committed fully to the entry, too far in to retreat quickly, not yet far enough to see what waited beyond. Think about the mind that designed that. This is not reactive defense. This is not a wall built to stop something already coming. This is premeditated, engineered, the product of someone who sat down and thought through the experience of being attacked, step by step, meter by meter, and then built the answer into the stone. The mainstream explanation for Kuelap frames the Chachapoya as a regional mountain culture responding to local threats. That explanation fits some of the evidence. It does not fit the entrances, because here is the detail the mainstream account tends to pass over quietly. The entrance design at Kuelap has no close parallel anywhere in the Andes. The narrowing passage, the rising walls, the controlled compression of an attacking force into single file, these are features found in fortress traditions on the other side of the world. Mycenaean Greece, certain Bronze Age fortifications in the ancient Near East, cultures separated from the Chachapoya by an ocean and thousands of years. The standard response to that observation is convergence, independent invention, similar problems producing similar solutions. That response is reasonable. It is also convenient, because if the entrances were simply a practical response to a practical threat, they did not need to be this precise. They did not need the false floor. They did not need the specific compression ratios that modern architects have noted when surveying the passages. A wall with an opening stops an attacker. What exists at Kuelap does considerably more than stop. Processes, controls. It humiliates the physics of an attacking force before that force has done anything at all. And that level of intentionality points towards something the evidence keeps suggesting and the textbooks keep stepping around. The people who built these entrances had thought very carefully about what was coming. You have passed through the entrance. The walls have released you, and now the mountain opens. What lies behind the defenses of Kuelap is not what the defenses prepare you for. After the compression of the gateway, after the false floor, after the architecture's sustained argument that this place was built to resist, you step into something that looks, at first, almost peaceful. A city. Not the ruins of a military outpost stripped to its functional essentials. A city, with neighborhoods, with streets, with the accumulated texture of a place where people woke up every morning and lived their lives. Archaeologists have surveyed approximately 420 structures inside the walls of Kuelap. 420. At the fortress's peak, estimates suggest between 2,000 and 3,000 people lived here permanently. Not soldiers rotating through a garrison. Families, communities, generations of people who were born inside these walls, grew up inside these walls, and died inside these walls. And almost every structure they built was circular. Not most of them, not the majority, almost all of them. In a continent where rectangular architecture dominated, where the Inca built in squares and straight lines, where coastal civilizations laid out their cities on grids, the Chachapoya looked at a flat floor plan and chose the circle. Again and again, across 400 buildings, across however many generations it took to fill this mountain with a city. That consistency is not casual. A people do not build 400 circular structures because circles are easier. They are not. A circular wall requires more precision than a straight one. The geometry is more demanding. The construction is more labor-intensive. You choose the circle because the circle means something. What it meant to the Chachapoya we cannot say with certainty. What we can say is that they decorated those circles. Running around the exterior walls of many Kuelap structures are friezes, bands of carved stonework in geometric and zoomorphic patterns, diamonds, stepped forms, animal shapes pressed into the stone in low relief. These are not structural elements. They serve no load-bearing purpose. They exist entirely because someone decided that the outside of a home should be beautiful. Think about what that decision costs on a mountaintop at 3,000 meters above sea level. Every hour spent carving a decorative frieze is an hour not spent quarrying, not spent farming, not spent on the 1,000 tasks that keeping a mountaintop city alive demands. The Chachapoya spent those hours anyway, which means they had enough surplus, enough food, enough labor, enough organizational capacity to afford beauty. That is not a desperate people clinging to a ridge. That is a civilization. And then there is El Tintero. Near the southern end of the site stands a structure that has no explanation. A tall circular tower, but inverted. Wider at the top than at the base. Narrowing as it rises from the ground and then flaring outward near the summit like a truncated cone turned upside down. No other structure in Kuelap looks like it. No other structure in the Andes looks like it. Archaeologists have proposed uses: a watchtower, a ceremonial platform, a storage facility, but none of the proposals fully account for the shape. The shape was chosen deliberately. The Chachapoya were not incompetent builders who accidentally produced an inverted cone. They built 420 other structures on this mountain. They understood geometry. They understood what they were doing. What they were doing with El Tintero remains genuinely unknown. Walk through the ruins of Kuelap today and something stops you. Two kinds of buildings, side by side. Circular Chachapoya walls pressing against rectangular Inca ones. Not separated into different zones. Not one replacing the other. Coexisting on the same mountain in the same space. The Inca did not coexist with the people they conquered. That was not how the empire worked. When they absorbed a territory, the transformation was total. Roads, administrators, Inca architecture imposed until the previous occupants became architecturally at least, invisible. Across 6,000 kilometers of South America, that pattern held without exception. Except here, the Inca relocated entire Chachapoya communities to distant parts of the empire specifically to break cultural memory. They knew how to erase a people. They had done it before. And yet the fortress, the greatest symbol of everything the Chachapoya had been, they left almost entirely alone. When a Spanish explorer reached Kuelap in 1843, he did not find a ruin. He found a forest. The walls were there, somewhere beneath the vegetation, but the cloud forest had consumed them so completely that the fortress was effectively invisible. One of the largest structures in the Americas had not been destroyed. It had not been dismantled. It had simply been forgotten, overgrown, unrecorded, unreported, for long enough that the jungle had begun to look like the mountain always had. The abandonment happened fast. Within a century of Spanish contact, the Chachapoya population had collapsed by an estimated 90%. Not through war, not through relocation, through disease moving faster than any army could. A civilization that had held its mountain against the Inca, that had chosen the Spanish over their conquerors, that had built 400 decorated homes above the cloud forest, reduced by 90% within a single generation. The people who remained did not pack up when they left. Archaeologists found the circular houses with objects still inside them. Ceramics, tools, personal belongings sitting exactly where they had been placed by hands that never came back for them. Not an evacuation, not a planned withdrawal. Something closer to an ending that arrived before anyone understood it was coming. The walls survived. The friezes survived. The false floor in the entrance survived. The mountain survived. The city died quietly, with the possessions of its last residents still sitting on the floors of its circular homes, waiting for people who were not coming back. And the forest moved in. Chapter 2: Gran Pajaten. There is a version of the discovery story that is clean and heroic and almost entirely wrong. In 1965, an American explorer named Jean Savoy descended into the cloud forests of northern Peru, fought through weeks of jungle, and emerged at the foot of a hilltop covered in circular stone towers. He cabled the news to the world press. The headlines named him the Discoverer. He named the site himself Gran Pajaten, the Great Pajaten, and for decades that version of events stood as the official account. Here is the version that the record actually supports. In 1963, 2 years before Savoy arrived, the mayor of the district of Pataz, a man named Carlos Tomas Torrealba Juarez, led a group of local villagers to the hilltop and documented what they found. There is evidence of an even earlier visit by a local resident named Eduardo Pena Meza, who may have reached the site as far back as 1929 while surveying land for a road project. Neither man cabled the world press. Neither man had a publisher waiting. And so when Savoy walked up to the ruins in 1965, guided there by those same Pataz villagers, and transmitted the news in his name, the world believed him. This matters not because it makes Savoy a villain. He was an explorer of genuine energy and courage, but because it tells you something about the kind of place Gran Pajaten has always been. A site that keeps being found and then keeps being forgotten. A city that the people closest to it have always known about, and that the world beyond has a habit of ignoring until someone with a press connection arrives to name it. And the moment the world did pay attention, it immediately began to destroy the thing it had found. By 1966, 1 year after Savoy's visit, the Peruvian government had dispatched a military expedition. Trees were felled. A helicopter landing pad was cut from the forest. The protective ring of vegetation that had held the city's moisture and shielded its stone for centuries was stripped away, and the ruins, exposed to direct sun and rain for the first time in living memory, began to dissolve. Slate mosaics that had endured since before the Inca crumbled in the open air. Stone reliefs that had held their detail through 5 centuries of cloud and mist started to flake apart within years of being found. The archaeologist Warren Church, who spent years working at the site, published a paper on this process. He gave it a title that has become one of the more quietly devastating phrases in Andean scholarship. Loving it to death. Gran Pajaten was closed. Permits were required. The forest was allowed to grow back over what remained. And for most of the decades since, the city has sat behind its ring of cloud, inaccessible to all but a handful of researchers, crumbling slowly in the dark. That is the true story of how Gran Pajaten was found. not a moment of triumph in the jungle. A slow process of discovery and damage and closure that is still playing out today. Which leaves the question that no one in 1966 thought to ask before they started clearing trees. What exactly is it that we found? Stand at the base of Building 1 and forget, for a moment, that you are in the jungle. Look at the stone in front of you. The building is circular. All the principal structures at Gran Pajaten are circular, with a diameter of 13 meters. It rises in 2 tiers divided by a cornice, a deliberate horizontal band that separates the platform below from the upper chamber above. A stairway of flat slate leads up to the entrance, and flanking that entrance, set into panels on either side of the door, are human figures in high relief. Not scratched into the surface, not painted on, raised from it, carved so that the figures stand proud of the stone, arms bent at the elbow, knees turned outward in a posture that appears again and again in Andean ceremonial art, a posture of display, of authority, of invitation. Human figures watching everyone who enters, as they have watched everyone who has entered for 600 years. Around the upper section of the building runs a band of geometric decoration, diamond shapes, stepped motifs, angular repeated forms, all built not from carved solid stone, but from fitted pieces of slate assembled like a mosaic. Each piece selected for its shape, each piece set against its neighbors so that the pattern emerges from the relationship between the parts rather than from a single carved surface. This is not primitive work. This is not the output of a people at the beginning of their craft. This is a mature decorative tradition requiring both a design vocabulary and the skill to execute it across a curved surface in thin pieces of a stone that does not forgive mistakes. And here the comparison becomes impossible to ignore, because if you have seen the exterior decoration on the circular buildings at Kuelap, the Great Chachapoya Fortress in the Utcubamba Valley, 300 kilometers to the northwest, you have seen this before. The same diamond friezes, the same stepped motifs, the same posture of the human figures, a coherent decorative language spoken consistently across sites that are separated by days of mountain travel. The mainstream reading of this is straightforward, and it is probably correct. The Chachapoya were a culturally unified people, organized into regional chiefdoms but sharing a single artistic tradition, and Gran Pajaten and Kuelap are simply 2 expressions of the same cultural inheritance. The same hand, spread across a mountain range. But that reading, taken seriously, forces you to confront a question the textbooks leave politely unanswered. What kind of society produces a consistent, sophisticated, continent-spanning decorative tradition across settlements separated by terrain so difficult that getting between them today takes a week? And what kind of society builds that tradition's most ornate known expression, a mosaic-clad ceremonial city, in the single most inaccessible location it could have chosen? You do not build Gran Pajaten here by accident. You choose this ridge at this altitude, in this particular fold of cloud forest, with deliberate intention. The view from the summit reaches across the Monte Cristo River Valley in every direction. In clear weather, you can see for 50 kilometers. Someone wanted to be up here, and they wanted whatever happened up here to be very hard to reach. We should say plainly who the Chachapoya were, because the official version undersells them. The textbook phrase is cloud forest people or cloud warriors. These are not wrong exactly, but they suggest a kind of romantic simplicity, a mountain people isolated, building in stone, resisting the Inca. The reality is considerably stranger and more impressive than that. The Chachapoya occupied a vast territory across the northeastern Andes, building an interconnected network of settlements, ceremonial centers, and agricultural systems in terrain that still challenges modern travelers. They buried their dead in places that make every person who looks at them stop and count. The sarcophagi of Karagia, one of the most photographed Chachapoya funerary sites, stand on a ledge of bare rock 200 meters above the valley floor. They are human-shaped clay figures, each up to 2.5 meters tall, each housing a body arranged in a seated position, each staring outward over the valley below. The ledge they occupy is physically unreachable without modern climbing equipment. How the Chachapoya set them there is not fully understood. At Los Pinchudos, close to Gran Pajaten itself, a row of painted wooden figures projects from a cliff face inside a rock cleft, painted in bright colors, watching the forest below. The structures are built with wooden roofs. The painted clay has survived in the open air for centuries. What you are dealing with when you deal with the Chachapoya is a civilization that consistently chose the most difficult, the most vertiginous, the most inaccessible places it could find, for its ceremonial centers, for its burial sites, for its great fortresses, for its mosaic-clad cities, and then built in those places with a precision and a beauty that was not strictly necessary for any purely practical purpose. They were not building for convenience. They were building for something else, for meaning, for visibility, for proximity to something they found in the heights. The Inca, who absorbed most of South America with remarkable efficiency, took a very long time to absorb the Chachapoya. They tried repeatedly. They were resisted repeatedly. They eventually succeeded, but only by force, only partially, and only in the late 15th century, just decades before the Spanish arrived and the Chachapoya were exposed to European disease. Gran Pajaten was the ceremonial heart of that people's world. And until very recently, we thought we knew roughly how large it was. We were wrong by a factor of 5. In 2022, a team from the World Monuments Fund arrived above the cloud forest with a set of instruments that did not require cutting a single tree. Airborne LiDAR, terrestrial laser scanning, photogrammetry, the assembly of tens of thousands of overlapping photographs into a three-dimensional model of a surface accurate to the millimeter. The forest above Gran Pajaten was mapped layer by layer. The canopy was stripped away digitally. And what lay beneath it? A ridge that everyone had assumed was mostly explored, mostly understood, turned out to be something else entirely. 26 structures. That was the number everyone knew. The number that had stood in the record since the 1980s surveys. The number that gave Gran Pajaten its scale in the imagination. The laser found more than 130. Let that sit for a moment. For 60 years, researchers had been looking at less than a quarter of what was actually there. The new structures include not only buildings but evidence of an extensive pre-Hispanic road system. Roads that linked Gran Pajaten to other known Chachapoya sites across the region, to La Playa, to Papayas, and to Los Pinchudos just down the valley. Not a remote outpost. Not an isolated ceremonial center on a forgotten hilltop. A node. A hub. A city that was the center of something much larger than anyone had been willing to say. The World Monuments Fund concluded that Gran Pajaten was not an isolated ceremonial center, but part of a larger network of settlements spanning multiple periods. The same project confirmed occupation stretching back centuries before the visible architecture, suggesting this ridge was used and reused across generations. We were not looking at the whole city. We may not yet be looking at the whole story. Go back to building back to the 5 figures watching the entrance. There is a detail in the frieze that most accounts pass over quickly. The human figures are stylized, arms flexed, knees outward, but they are not generic. They have faces. Each face is distinct. And above the entrance, worked into the geometric band of the upper tier, are birds. Large birds, wings spread, set into the mosaic between the diamond patterns. Condors. The condor appears in Chachapoya decorative art at multiple sites. It appears on the cliff tombs. It appears in textile fragments recovered from burial contexts. In Andean cosmology from the northern highlands all the way south to the Altiplano, the condor is the messenger between the human world and the world above it. The great bird that carries the dead upward, that moves between earth and sky with a freedom no human body can claim. And the Chachapoya, who buried their dead in places only birds could reach, who built their ceremonial centers on the highest ridges they could find, who placed their mosaic-clad city in permanent cloud, at an elevation where condors actually fly, were, on the evidence of their buildings, entirely serious about that connection. And then the Inca arrived, a civilization famous for absorbing other peoples, reshaping their traditions, and folding them into the empire. At Gran Pajaten, they did something very characteristic. They built on top of it. The visible ruins at Gran Pajaten date architecturally to the Inca period. The ceramic evidence and the radiocarbon dates tell us people were here long before, but the buildings that survive, the circular platforms, the mosaic friezes, the stairways of fitted slate, these were raised or substantially rebuilt during Inca occupation of the site, which means that when the Inca arrived, they did not tear down what they found. They incorporated it. They raised their own structures on the Chachapoya foundations and kept the mosaic tradition alive. What did they see that made them preserve rather than demolish? What was in these circular buildings, in these condor friezes, in this particular ridge above the Monte Cristo River, that earned the deference of the most powerful empire in the pre-Columbian Americas? The honest answer is that we do not know. And the 2025 laser survey, which confirmed more than 100 structures we had never catalogued, raises the possibility that some of the answer is still underneath the forest, still unmapped, still waiting for the right question to be asked of it. Let us be honest about where we stand, because honesty is what the evidence demands here. The mainstream account of Gran Pajaten is not wrong. The Chachapoya built here. The Inca rebuilt and extended the site. The ceramic sequence and the radiocarbon dates and the architectural analysis are broadly consistent with a story of occupation running from at least 200 BCE through the late 15th century. None of what we have walked through tonight overthrows that sequence. What it does is complicate the scale, and scale here matters. A site that we thought contained 26 structures contains more than 130. A site that was considered a remote ceremonial outpost turns out to be the hub of a road network connecting major Chachapoya centers across the region. A site that has been officially studied since the 1960s was, until 2025, understood at less than a quarter of its actual complexity. There are questions here that no one has yet answered. The 2022 to 2024 survey mapped the buildings but did not open them. What is inside more than 100 circular stone rooms on a Peruvian mountaintop, sealed by the forest since the 16th century, has not yet been seen by modern eyes. What does the road network connect that we still haven't found? And what is underneath the site? The ceramic evidence reaching back to 200 BCE sits in soil layers beneath the Inca-era architecture. Something was on this ridge, doing something that produced pottery, more than 2,000 years before the buildings we can see today were raised. No one has excavated deeply enough to say with confidence what that was. These are not fringe questions. They are the questions the laser itself generated. Mainstream scholarship, peer-reviewed and carefully documented, produced these uncertainties in 2025. The site is not mysterious because theorists have projected mysteries onto it. It is mysterious because the more carefully you look at it, the more it reveals that it has not yet been fully looked at. Who were these people, really? Not the regional chiefdom, not the cloud warriors, not the people the Inca absorbed and the Spanish destroyed. Who were they in their own understanding of themselves, before anyone arrived to name them? Chapter 3, Shoria. Begin with the silence, because the first and most important fact about Mount Shoria is not the stones. It is how long those stones went unseen. This is southern Siberia, Kemerovo Oblast to be exact, a region of mountains and rivers in the crease where the Altai Range folds down into the West Siberian plain. The indigenous people here are the Shor, a Turkic people who have lived in these valleys since at least the 6th century. The Russians who arrived in 1607 called them the Kuznetsk Tatars, the blacksmith Tatars, because the Shor knew how to smelt iron from local or at a time when most of their neighbors did not. They were metal workers in a mountain that, it turns out, holds rather a lot of metal. And then, in the 20th century, the Soviets arrived in force. Coal was found, then iron. The Kemerovo region became one of the industrial hearts of the Soviet Union, and the mountains that surrounded it became strategic territory. Checkpoints went up across the roads. Foreign visitors were turned back. Scientific expeditions from outside the region required permissions that were rarely granted and more rarely honored. The result is that a mountain range containing some of the most dramatic geological formations on the planet spent the better part of a century effectively invisible to the outside world. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the checkpoints came down. And slowly, across the 1990s and 2000s, people began to walk into those mountains and look at what the glaciers and the rivers had spent 10,000 years exposing on the ridge lines. What Georgy Sidorov found in 2013 was not a rumor and not a legend. It was a wall, sitting on a summit, in plain sight, in a country that had simply never had the occasion to notice it. Sit with that. A structure of this potential scale, in a country with a functional scientific establishment and a long tradition of geological survey, undocumented until 11 years ago. Not because it was hidden, because no one had been allowed to look. We should be honest about what we know and what we do not, because this is where clarity matters more than drama. The photographs taken by Sidorov's team in 2013 show something that stops you. Granite blocks, massive ones, with flat upper surfaces, with corners that appear squared. stacked on top of one another to heights that Sidorov measured at roughly 40 meters in some sections, stretching along the ridgeline for close to 200 meters. Standing beside the blocks in those photographs, the researchers look like children standing beside a house. Not a tall house, a house where the first floor alone runs 5 meters up. The mainstream geological answer was already in the literature before Sidorov's expedition. Soviet-era geologists, mapping the region in the late 1990s, classified the formations at Mount Kuelap, the specific summit in question, as denudated prepared ridges. In plain language, joints in the bedrock, widened by water and ice and centuries of freeze-thaw cycling, until the granite broke along its natural planes and left rectangular blocks sitting where the surrounding material had crumbled away. It is a real process. It happens. There are mountains in Scotland, in Australia, in South Africa, where granite weathers into forms that look, from certain angles, remarkably like stacked stone. Geologists have a word for the hills that result: tors. And tors can produce shapes that make people stop and stare. So let us grant that explanation its full weight. Let us say it plainly. The geological case that these are natural formations is not foolish. It is the default position, and for a reason. And now let us ask what the default position does not account for. Because there are things in those photographs that do not fit comfortably into the tor explanation. The flat upper surfaces, for one. In a tor formed by differential erosion, the exposed faces tend to follow the natural jointing planes of the rock, which run in multiple directions. What you get is a blocky surface, angular, yes, but irregular. The faces at Shoria, in multiple photographs from multiple angles, are not merely angular. They are level. Flat in the way a poured concrete floor is flat, not in the way a broken rock face is flat. And the corners. The corners are the detail that the geological explanation struggles most obviously with. Where two faces of a natural tor block meet, you get a corner shaped by erosion, rounded, softened, the sharp angle worn away by the same water and ice that formed the joint. The corners at Shoria, in photograph after photograph, are not rounded. They are crisp. They hold their angle the way a cut block holds it, not the way a weathered one does. We are not claiming this proves human hands. We are saying that the photographs raise a question that natural formation answers too quickly and too confidently. And then there is the thing the compasses did. Every member of Sidorov's team carried a compass. This is standard practice in remote mountain terrain where GPS signals can be unreliable and maps of the ridgeline are imprecise. On the descent from the summit, they noticed something. The compasses were not working correctly. Not misbehaving in the casual sense of drifting a few degrees off true north. The needles were actively deflecting, pointing toward the stones, or in some accounts pointing away from them, in either case registering an anomaly strong enough that multiple instruments, carried by different people, all showed the same behavior at the same location. The immediate explanation is magnetic rock. Granite sometimes contains magnetite, a naturally magnetic iron oxide mineral that can distort compass readings in the vicinity of a large outcropping. It is real, it is documented, and it would explain a compass deviation near a granite formation without requiring anything unusual at all. But here is the detail worth holding on to. Not all of the affected blocks showed the same behavior. Some deflected the needles one way, some deflected them the other, and several members of the team noted that the deflection was stronger near the block faces that appeared most flat and most worked, not uniformly distributed across the natural outcropping. We cannot draw a firm conclusion from compass readings recorded by a non-specialist expedition in 2013 and never independently verified. That is an honest limitation, and we name it plainly. What we can say is this: if certain faces of these blocks behave differently magnetically from others, that is a question worth an answer. Magnetite concentrations in granite are not random, they follow the crystalline structure of the rock. A block that has been subjected to intense heat, or to a cutting process that exposed fresh crystal faces, could, in principle, display a different magnetic signature at that face than at an unworked surface. Sidorov's team also noted something else. Something the geological explanation does not address at all. Burn marks. Not discoloration from lichen or oxidation. Burn marks. Patches on the stone faces where the granite appeared vitrified. Melted and resolidified. The crystals fused together in a way that requires temperatures far beyond anything a Siberian winter can produce. And blocks, scattered up to 500 meters from the wall, that appeared to have been thrown. Not rolled, not slid, but thrown, by some force violent enough to move 1,000-ton pieces of stone across a mountain. Let us do the mathematics that the official silence has avoided. The blocks at Shoria, if they are worked stone, are not merely large. They are categorically larger than anything in the ancient record. The biggest stone at the Great Pyramid at Giza weighs around 80 tons. The trilithon blocks at Baalbek, the ones that stopped the Romans cold, the ones that no engineer of the classical world bothered to move because moving them was not a problem any technology they possessed could solve, those run to around 800 tons for the largest confirmed example. The pregnant woman's stone, excavated and abandoned in its quarry at Baalbek, comes in at approximately 1,500 tons. It is generally described as the upper limit of what ancient stone workers attempted, and it was never moved at all. It simply sits in the quarry where it was cut, a testament to the ambition of people who began something they could not finish. The blocks at Shoria are estimated, and the honest word here is estimated, because no certified survey has been conducted, at between 1,000 and 4,000 tons each. The wall contains dozens of them. No ancient civilization with a verified presence in southern Siberia is known to have worked stone at any scale. The shore built in timber and worked in iron. The cultures of the Altai and the West Siberian plain left burial mounds, petroglyphs, and wooden structures. None of them left cut stone. None of them built walls. So whoever moved these blocks, if they were moved, was operating at a scale roughly twice what the engineers of Baalbek reached, in a mountain environment far more hostile than the Lebanese plain, with access to none of the rivers and trade routes that made ancient building at that scale feasible anywhere else on the planet. The mainstream position is that the question does not arise because the blocks were not moved, they formed where they sit. That position may be correct. It is also the position that makes the fewest demands on our imagination, which is not always the same thing as the position that is true. There is a thread in this story that almost no one in the alternative archaeology community has ever pulled, and it runs much closer to an answer than the geological debate. The Shore people. They have lived in the Shoria Mountains, by their own account and the account of the written record, since at least the 6th century. They arrived as an assemblage of Turkic-speaking tribes from Central Asia, settled in the mountain valleys, and became something unusual. A forest people who were also metalworkers. Not village smiths hammering out horseshoes. Serious iron smelters. The Russians who encountered them in 1607 were impressed enough to name the entire region after the craft. Iron smelting requires something that not every landscape provides. It requires, or obviously, it requires fuel, timber, which the Shoria Mountains have in abundance. And it requires, less obviously, knowledge. The kind of knowledge that is not invented casually. The kind that is passed down across generations, from a time when someone first learned to look at a particular kind of rock and recognize what was inside it. Here is where we have to be completely honest, because this site sits at a different place on the evidential spectrum than the others we have walked through. At Baalbek, we have cut stone whose surfaces have been surveyed by engineers. At Giza, we have blocks whose joining faces have been measured to fractions of a millimeter. At Cusco, we have walls that have survived 20 major earthquakes and still hold their tolerance. We can walk up to those stones and put our instruments against them and get numbers. At Shoria, we have photographs. We have one expedition's field notes. We have geological classifications made from Soviet-era survey maps, not from direct sampling of the specific blocks in question. We have compass anomalies reported by non-specialists and never independently reproduced. We have burn marks described in narrative but not analyzed in any published laboratory study. What we do not have is a single peer-reviewed survey of the specific formations at Mount Quilliam summit using modern instruments. Not one. In 11 years since the photographs circulated the world and sparked a debate that has not settled down, no team has published a technical paper with field measurements of those blocks. Think about what that absence means. If the geological explanation is correct, if these are simply natural tours, beautiful and dramatic but unremarkable to any trained geologist, then a single field season with a team of 2 or 3 scientists and a portable ground-penetrating radar unit would settle the question permanently. Publish the joint analysis, show the fracture planes, demonstrate that the flat surfaces are bedding planes rather than worked faces, and the mystery dissolves. That paper has not been written, and until it is, every position remains provisional, which leaves us with something rarer than certainty. Clean question. A question that can only be answered one way. By going there, putting instruments against the stone, and reading what the granite says in the only language it speaks. 4,000 tons, or a trick of the light. A wall built by hands we cannot name, or a ridge shaped by a process that required no hands at all. The mountain is not in a hurry. It has been sitting there longer than the question has existed. Chapter 4: Sillustani. Begin with the shape, because the shape is the first thing that stops you. Every principle of structural engineering, from the moment humans first stacked one stone on another, points toward the same conclusion. You build wide at the base and narrow toward the top. You put the weight below. You let gravity do the work of holding things together. The builders of Sillustani looked at that principle and reversed it. The chulpas, the funerary towers that cover this peninsula, are constructed in an inverted conical form. Each course of stone is corbelled slightly outward beyond the one beneath it, so that the tower flares as it rises, wider at the crown than at the ground. The largest examples reach nearly 12 meters in height and 7 meters in diameter at the top. Now hold that image. A 12-meter stone tower, no mortar, flaring outward as it climbs, at 4,000 meters above sea level in one of the most seismically active regions on Earth. It should, on paper, fall. It has not fallen. Not in 1,000 years. The reason it has not fallen is not luck. It is engineering. The corbelled geometry distributes load in ways that make the structure more stable than it appears, not less. The weight of the upper courses presses inward and downward in a calculated arc. The dry-laid blocks, fitted with enough precision that no mortar was needed, lock together under compression rather than pulling apart under tension. Modern engineers who have surveyed these towers with three-dimensional scanning tools have described the load distribution as deliberate and sophisticated. Not accidental, not lucky, designed. The mainstream explanation is reasonable, and we should state it fairly. The Kala people, an Aymara-speaking culture that dominated the Lake Titicaca Basin from roughly the 9th century CE onward, developed this corbelling technique over generations of building. The form became a tradition. The tradition became a statement. The larger and more technically daring the tower, the greater the prestige of the family buried inside. That explanation holds together. It deserves its full weight before we ask anything more of it. And then we ask one more thing. Because there are 91 of these towers on this peninsula. And across those 91 towers, the stonework does not behave the way a single culture's evolving tradition is supposed to behave. It runs backward. Here is what the textbooks tell us, and we should hold it carefully because it contains an anomaly they have never fully resolved. The smaller chulpas at Sillustani are cruder, rougher stone, simpler fitting, less precise in their coursework. These are attributed to the Kala, the culture credited with founding the site, building primarily between the 12th and 14th centuries CE. The larger chulpas, the ones with the near-perfect dry stone jointing, the ones with the corbelling so precise that the towers have outlasted everything built beside them, those belong to the Inca, who absorbed the Kala in the 15th century and added their own towers to the complex. So the sequence runs: crude first, precise second. Earlier builders, rougher work. Later builders, finer work. In that direction, the timeline is clean. But step back and look at what that sequence requires us to accept about the broader Andean world. At Tiwanaku, on the Bolivian shore of Lake Titicaca, less than 200 kilometers from Sillustani, the peak of precision stonework arrives not in the 15th century but centuries earlier. By 500 CE, Tiwanaku masons were cutting hard andesite to tolerances that modern engineers still struggle to explain. By the 6th and 7th centuries, the temple complex of Pumapunku was being assembled with H-shaped stone clamps and joints so tight a blade cannot pass between them. Tiwanaku collapsed around 1000 CE. Some academics believe that in the wake of that collapse, Sillustani became, in their own words, the most prominent pilgrimage center in the Titicaca Basin. A sacred site rising to prominence precisely when the greatest stone-working tradition in the region was fading. We are not told that Tiwanaku built Sillustani. The distances and the cultures are different enough that the claim would be too large to support. But here is the question the standard chronology tends to sidestep. When the Kala arrived at this peninsula and began to build their towers, what tradition were they drawing from? The Altiplano does not produce stone-working knowledge from nothing. The Kala were the political heirs of a region where, for 5 centuries, some of the most sophisticated masonry in human history had been practiced. The crude lower towers and the precise upper ones may not be telling a story of a culture improving over time. They may be telling a story of a culture that inherited something it only partially understood, and a later empire that understood it better. That is a harder claim than the textbook version. It is also a more honest response to what is actually standing on this peninsula. Walk the site long enough and you will find the tower that answers some questions and opens others. Near the southern end of the peninsula stands a chulpa that was never finished. Its lower courses are complete, fitted polygonal blocks in the Inca style, beveled edges, characteristic precision, almost no visible joints. The upper portion simply stops. Mid-construction, the final form never achieved. And against its unfinished wall, the ancient ramp is still there. Not reconstructed, not moved. The original construction ramp, built from carefully piled pebbles, still leaning against the stone it was used to build, exactly as it was left on the day work stopped. Scattered nearby, rough-cut blocks that were never lifted into place lie where the workers set them down. Whatever interrupted this construction, it interrupted it without warning. We do not know what that interruption was. The Spanish conquest is the obvious candidate. The chaos of epidemic and invasion moved faster than any army and stopped projects across the entire Andean world in mid-action. But the honest answer is that no record tells us why this particular tower was abandoned in this particular moment. What the unfinished tower does tell us, and this is something the standard guides tend to pass over quietly, is the contrast written directly into its stone. The Inca sections of this tower are visibly, measurably different from the Kala sections nearby. Not better in every respect. Different in philosophy, where Kala builders stacked rounded, relatively undressed stones and relied on the corbelling geometry itself to provide stability. Inca masons cut each block individually to interlock with its specific neighbors. Two approaches to the same structural problem. Two traditions of knowledge about how stone behaves under load. Side by side on the same peninsula, sometimes on the same tower, an older tradition and a newer one. And the mainstream story tells us confidently which is which. Older equals cruder. Newer equals finer. But there is one detail the mainstream story does not linger on. The Kala towers that survive, the ones the textbooks call cruder, are still standing after 800 years. And more than a few of the attempts to restore or stabilize them in the modern era have struggled to match the structural performance of what was already there. Near the center of the site, the most photographed tower carries a single carved figure on its east-facing face. A lizard, pressed into the stone in shallow bas-relief, rendered with enough care that the form is still legible after all the centuries of wind and freeze on this exposed plateau. The tower takes its name from this carving. The Chulpa del Lagarto, the lizard tower. In Andean symbolic tradition, the lizard carried a specific meaning. It was an animal of regeneration, capable of regrowing what it lost, associated with the cycle of renewal, with the idea that what dies may return. Carved onto the east face of a funerary tower, oriented toward the rising sun, the message is not subtle. But the lizard is not the only solar signal at Sillustani. The entrance to every chulpa on this peninsula faces east. One tower facing east could be coincidence. 91 towers facing east is design, oriented toward the point where the sun rises, where, in the Andean cosmology of these people, the sun was reborn from Mother Earth each morning. The dead, sealed inside their towers in the fetal position they had occupied before birth, faced that same direction. The architecture is arguing, with consistent and deliberate geometry, that what entered these towers would one day come back out of them. This is not the burial tradition of a simple mountain people burying their dead in convenient holes. This is a civilization with a fully developed theology of rebirth, expressed in stone at the highest level of architectural precision available to them. And the solar orientation goes further than the doorways. Across the peninsula, researchers have identified ritual areas called intihuatanas, solar circles, observation points from which the movement of the sun could be tracked across the year. The same word, and the same function, appears at sites associated with Inca sacred astronomy hundreds of kilometers away. The same practice, the same obsession with marking celestial cycles, the same understanding that the movements of the sky were not decoration but calendar, a record of when to plant, when to harvest, when the dead were closest to return. We tend to think of astronomical knowledge as belonging to a certain kind of civilization. Literate, urban, institutionally complex. And yet here, at 4,000 meters, a people the textbooks classify as a regional herding culture built a necropolis aligned to the sun with the same precision that Egyptian temple builders used at Karnak. Half a world away and in a tradition with no known connection to this plateau. The mainstream response to that observation is convergence. Independent invention. Similar skies producing similar observations in separate cultures. That response is reasonable as far as it goes. The sun rises in the east everywhere. That part does not require explanation. What requires explanation is the specific recurring combination, the circular tower, the corbel geometry, the east-facing entrance, the solar observation points, the lizard of regeneration. Not one of these elements alone, all of them together, on one peninsula, in one concentrated expression of something that took a very long time to think through. Here is something that should be said plainly, because it matters more than people realize. You cannot carbon date a stone. Radiocarbon dating measures the decay of organic carbon in things that were once alive: wood, bone, charcoal, fiber. A block of andesite has no organic content. No laboratory on Earth can take a chip from one of these towers and return a date for the cutting. When researchers date Sillustani to the 12th through 15th centuries CE, they are dating organic material found at the site. Burial goods. Organic remains inside the tombs. Charcoal from ritual fires. All of those dates are real and carefully measured. They tell us with confidence when people were using this site, placing their dead inside these towers, and conducting ceremonies on this plateau. They do not tell us when the stones were first cut. A pot placed inside a tower in the year 1300 CE dates the pot. It dates the burial. It does not date the walls around it. This is not a fringe claim or a conspiracy. It is a basic limit of the methodology, acknowledged openly in archaeological literature. The distinction between when a site was used and when it was built is genuinely difficult to establish when the construction material is stone. And at Sillustani, no comprehensive excavation has been published in decades. The site, in the words of one recent survey, remains underrepresented in international archaeological literature relative to its scale and preservation. That silence is worth sitting with. 91 funerary towers. Thousands of additional semi-subterranean tombs across the peninsula. Evidence of ritual areas, observation platforms, corrals, stairways, and monoliths beyond the towers themselves. An entire sacred landscape that some academics consider the most significant pilgrimage site in the post-Tiwanaku-Titicaca Basin. And the last comprehensive excavation is decades old. We are not claiming that Sillustani is older than the dates suggest. We are saying that the question has not been seriously asked with modern methods. Ground-penetrating radar, LiDAR, comprehensive stratigraphic survey, the same technologies that in the last decade revealed an entire urban civilization in the Bolivian Amazon, that confirmed a mile-long tunnel network beneath the streets of Cusco, none of those tools have been systematically applied to this peninsula. The towers are standing in plain sight. The ground beneath them has barely been read. Stand on the peninsula at dusk and let the light do what it does here. The sun drops toward the altiplano and the towers turn the color of old blood against the dark surface of Lake Umeo. The unfinished tower stands with its scattered blocks around it. The lizard tower faces east, as it has faced east for somewhere between 600 and 800 years, waiting for a morning it was designed to greet. The ramp leans against the stone that never received its final course. The Kala who built here are gone. The Inca who refined and extended the site are gone. The colonial administrators who came after them left the towers largely alone. Too remote, too high, too difficult to dismantle, and too stubborn to fall. The grave robbers who dynamited several towers looking for gold found less than they hoped for and left more damage than they understood. The towers remained. None of this proves that Sillustani is older than the textbooks say. What it proves is that the textbooks have not finished asking. The Kala were real. Their mastery was real. The Inca additions were real. But all of those certainties sit on top of one question that no one has seriously pressed with modern tools. Whose tradition did the Kala inherit when they first chose this peninsula and looked out at the cold water and decided that this was the place to build their towers of the dead? The towers keep standing, through every earthquake and every season, holding whatever they know in the geometry of their impossible shape. So I want to hear from you, not the textbook answer. After everything we have just walked through, who do you think first chose this peninsula and why? Drop your theory in the comments below. The bolder the better, because the official story has already had its careful say. Chapter 5, Aramu Muru. Most ancient sites have a problem with their date. The date is too convenient or too precise, or built on an inscription that tells us when someone signed their name to something, not when the something was built. Aramu Muru has the opposite problem. It has no date at all. Not an approximate one. Not a contested one. Not a range of centuries that scholars are still arguing over. The structure carved into the face of Hayu Marca Mountain has never yielded a single datable piece of evidence. No charcoal from a ritual fire. No buried offering. No organic material of any kind that a laboratory could measure and return a number from. The site is clean. Whoever made it left nothing behind. So when you read that Aramu Muru was built by the Tiwanaku civilization, and you will read that on archaeology websites, in guidebooks, in the confident paragraph that every article eventually produces, you are reading a guess. A stylistic comparison. Someone looked at the carving, looked at what the Tiwanaku were doing in the same region during the same broad period, and drew a line between them. Here is where we have to be fair to that guess, because the Tiwanaku deserved better than to be used as a default attribution. They were among the most capable builders the ancient Americas ever produced. On the southern shore of Lake Titicaca, they raised the temple complex of Pumapunku, stones of hard andesite fitted together with a precision that modern engineers still cite in papers. They engineered raised agricultural fields and hydraulic systems across some of the most inhospitable land on Earth. These were people who had mastered stone at scale. They could have carved this door. The capability was there. But capability is not the same as proof. And here is what the mainstream account steps around quietly. The carving style at Aramu Muru does not match Tiwanaku work. Not closely. Not conclusively. Researchers who have examined the site note that the technique used here sits outside what we can confidently attribute to any documented culture in the region. It is either a different people, a different period, or a tradition operating in this landscape that left no other trace. So we are left with a structure of clear intention and considerable skill, sitting alone on a mountain above the world's highest navigable lake, with no date, no builder, and no explanation for the circular hollow at its center that every visitor notices and no archaeologist has yet accounted for. That hollow is where this investigation really begins. Run your eye across the face of Aramu Muru and the mind keeps snagging on the same detail. The surface is flat, genuinely flat, the kind of flat that is difficult at this scale, that requires a method for checking your work across 10 meters of vertical stone. The right angles at the corners are clean. The proportions are deliberate. At the center, pressed slightly inward from the face, is the T-shaped recess, human-scaled, body width, sized for passage, with a small circular depression at its base. That depression is the detail that does not fit any explanation the mainstream has offered. It is too precise to be erosion. The sandstone around it is weathered in the way that centuries of high-altitude wind and rain weather sandstone, worn, slightly softened at the edges, carrying the texture of great age. The hollow does not look like that. It looks worked, shaped to receive something specific, something with a defined geometry, something that would press flush against it and lock. We should say plainly what we are not going to do here. There is a version of this story that involves spacecraft and golden devices from other dimensions, and it has had its run on some channels. We are setting it down. Not because the hollow is uninteresting, it is deeply interesting, but because the explanation the evidence actually supports is stranger than the fantasy, and it costs nothing to just follow where the facts go. The fact is this. Across the oral traditions of two separate peoples, the Aymara who lived beside this mountain for centuries before the Inca, and the Quechua-speaking Inca who inherited the high plateau from them, there is a consistent description of an object that fit into the center of this door. They called it by different names. The Inca called it the key of the gods of the seven rays. The accounts agree on its shape, a golden disc. And they agree on one other detail that nobody who studies this site has managed to dismiss. The recess in the niche is circular. A skeptic can argue that legends grow around the features they find in the stone, that the story of the disc was invented to explain a hollow that was already there. That is fair. But the inverse is also worth sitting with. If the disc was invented whole cloth, why does the hollow match its described dimensions? Why is it positioned exactly where you would press a key if you were trying to open something? Why is it too small to be structural and too specific to be decorative? The hollow is not nothing. It is the most precise thing on the entire surface. And it points directly to a story that is far older than the people who told it to us. In 1532, the Spanish entered Cusco. They found the Coricancha, the Temple of the Sun, the holiest building in the Inca Empire, and they stripped it. The walls had been lined with sheets of solid gold, each one engraved with sacred imagery. The courtyard held a garden where every plant, every animal, every ear of corn had been cast in gold to exact scale. The Spanish melted it all. They built a Dominican church on the foundations and planted a cross where the sun disk had stood. Almost everything was taken. But the oral tradition, carried by the Aymara, preserved through 4 centuries of colonial suppression, says that not everything stayed to be found. A high priest named Aramu Muru served at the Coricancha as the guardian of the most sacred object in the temple, the golden disc, the key of the gods of the 7 rays. It was used, the tradition says, not as a ritual decoration but as a functional object, a key to a threshold that had existed in the mountains long before the Inca built their empire around it. When word came that the Spanish were marching on Cusco, Aramu Muru took the disc and fled south across the high plateau, toward the lake the Inca believed was the birthplace of the world. He reached the mountain of Hayumarca. He stood before the door with other priests assembled around him. He pressed the disc into the hollow at the center of the T-shaped niche. The stone shimmered, the tradition says. Light came from the tunnel he entered. He was never seen again. Now, we have to be honest with you about what this story is, because honesty is what makes the hard parts land. The legend of Aramu Muru, in its complete form, is a conquest-era story. It explains a disappearance. It accounts for a golden object that the Spanish could not find, because the priest carrying it stepped somewhere the Spanish could not follow. Legends do this. They carry what the living cannot bear to lose into a space where it cannot be taken, into the sacred, into the unreachable, into the past. So the story of a man walking through a mountain may be, at one level, the story of a people preserving their most precious thing in the only vault the conquerors could never crack open: memory. But consider what the legend requires in order to work as a story at all. It requires that the door already existed before the Inca arrived. It requires that the knowledge of what to do with it, the disc, the ceremony, the assembled priests, had been maintained across generations long enough that a man fleeing on foot in 1532 could arrive at a remote mountain and know exactly what to press into which hollow. That tradition did not begin with the Inca. The Inca were newcomers to the high plateau. They arrived in the region in the late 1400s, several centuries after the Tiwanaku had already risen and fallen. They inherited a landscape of sacred sites they did not build, and they were careful to distinguish between what they had made and what they had found. Pachacuti, the emperor who built Machu Picchu, was meticulous about recording which monuments were his and which were older. The Inca did not claim Aramu Muru. The Aymara, who predate both the Inca and the Tiwanaku in this region, did not claim it either. They called it the Devil's Gate and they kept their distance. Nobody claimed it, because nobody knew who had made it. That gap between the door's existence and any living memory of its origin is the oldest and strangest thing about this place. To understand why Aramu Muru sits where it sits, you need to understand what Lake Titicaca is, not geographically but cosmologically. At 3,812 meters above sea level, it is the highest navigable lake on Earth. Its water is so still, so perfectly reflective under the Andean sky, that the Inca called it the place where the universe was born. Viracocha, the creator god, the father of all other Inca deities, rose from its surface and spoke the world into being. The lake was not a geographic feature in the Andean worldview. It was the axis of creation itself, the origin point, the place where everything began and to which everything, eventually, returns. The lake was not always at this level. Water rises over centuries. Whatever stood along the older, lower shoreline, whatever ceremonial roads led to the door at Hayumarca, whatever structures once framed the approach to Aramu Muru, has been swallowed. And now, the detail that the official record has not fully processed yet. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of Aramu Muru have found cavities behind the carved face. Not a continuation of the visible geometry, not more carved stone, not a planned chamber. Something else. Spaces inside the mountain, behind the surface that opens to the world, that nobody has entered and that nobody has been permitted to investigate. The Peruvian government protects the site. Formal excavation has never been authorized. And the Aymara communities in the surrounding region have, on record, asked that the stone be left undisturbed. Sit with that for a moment. The people who have lived beside this door the longest, who have watched over it across more generations than any academic institution has existed, are the ones most opposed to opening what is behind it. That is not the behavior of a community that believes the cavities are empty. There is one more thing about Aramu Muru that the standard accounts mention briefly and then move past, because there is no comfortable place to put it. The door is not alone. Across the Lake Titicaca Basin, on both the Peruvian and Bolivian shores, within a radius of a few hundred kilometers, there are carved stone thresholds cut into living rock that share the same formal language as Aramu Muru, the same flat-faced geometry, the same inset niche, the same decision to carve into the mountain rather than build away from it. The most famous of these is at Tiwanaku itself, where the Gateway of the Sun, a single block of andesite weighing 10 tons, carved with astronomical precision, featuring a central figure flanked by running attendants, stands as the entrance to a sacred enclosure. Two different structures, two different scales, but the same underlying idea, that the threshold between the ordinary world and the sacred one should be marked by a door cut from the hardest material available, shaped with the greatest precision attainable, and oriented toward the sky. That idea did not emerge once. It was practiced, repeated, refined across a region and a period broad enough to suggest not a single builder but a tradition, a body of knowledge about what a sacred threshold should look like and how it should function, passed from one generation of stonecutters to the next. Aramu Muru fits that tradition, but it does not match any specific practitioner within it. The Gateway of the Sun can be attributed to the Tiwanaku with confidence. It sits inside their city, among their buildings, in their characteristic stone. Aramu Muru sits alone, outside any settlement, in a style that overlaps with but does not belong to any documented culture in the basin. It is, in the vocabulary of art history, an orphan. Let us gather what is actually here, stripped of everything the imagination wants to add. 4.5 centuries ago, a man pressed a golden key into a hollow in a mountainside. He was never seen again. Whether you read that as history or as grief, the door is still there, still cut to the same proportions, still leading nowhere any living eye has seen, still holding in its hollow the exact shape of the thing that the last person to use it carried away. The official story has had 5 centuries to fill in the blank. It has not managed it yet. So I am leaving the question with you where it has always belonged. Who made the door at Hayumarca? What were they expecting to come through it? And what is sitting in the dark inside the mountain, behind the carved face, in the cavities that nobody has been allowed to open? Tell me in the comments. Not the careful answer, that one has already had its turn. The bold one. The one you actually believe. Chapter 6, Shimao. The first hint came in the 1970s. A scholar named Dai Ingson, from Northwest University, followed up on local stories about a sacred tree. That search led him to the earliest documented investigation of the site. It was modest work by later standards, but the jade was already there, already out of place, already asking a question nobody had the tools to answer yet. For decades, that's where things stayed. Curiosity, a handful of collected jades. Archaeology runs on funding and permission and slow, careful survey work, and Shimao simply wasn't a priority. It sat quietly under the lusts for another generation. Then, in 2011, everything changed. Sun Zhou-yong, now head of the Shaanxi Academy of Archaeology, led the first full excavation of the site. What he found stunned him. Standing inside it, he couldn't even grasp how big it really was. Relics from the Longshan culture period turned up on almost every hill around him. He nicknamed the ruins the Crazy Stones, half joking, because prehistoric cities in this part of China were supposed to be built from earth, not stone, and not preserved this well. The scale is hard to overstate. Shimao covers roughly 4 million square meters. That's nearly 6 times the size of the Forbidden City. It makes Shimao the largest city ruin of its era found anywhere in China. The main site dates to somewhere between 2300 and 1800 BCE, covers more than 400 hectares. At its heart is a central palace terrace, wrapped in 2 rings of stone wall, and rising above all of it, a stepped platform more than 70 meters tall. That's nearly half the height of the pyramids of Giza, built roughly in the same era on the other side of the world. But unlike Giza, this pyramid had a purpose beyond burial. At the top sat a palace, over 80,000 square meters, close to the size of 10 soccer fields. By 2012, Shimao made China's official list of the year's top 10 archaeological discoveries. It later earned international recognition as one of the major finds of the 21st century. This is not a fringe site. It's one of the most celebrated excavations in modern Chinese archaeology. And that matters, because the mystery here isn't about a cover-up. Nobody hid this city. But if nobody hid this city, why does nobody in the historical record seem to have written about it? Here's the puzzle at the center of Shimao, and it's a real one. The archaeologists who dug it up admit it openly. Before this excavation, the site was completely absent from ancient Chinese texts. No famous ruler, no recorded name. Nothing connects Shimao to any king or dynasty we know from the old records. That's a strange kind of silence. China's earliest texts were compiled centuries after the fact. They center on the Yellow River's middle and lower stretches, far to the south. They describe a legendary founding dynasty, the Xia, and a world of walled towns and sage kings. What they don't describe is a fortified, 1,500-acre metropolis on the edge of the Ordos Steppe, sitting right at the frontier between farmland and grassland. Let's be fair to the mainstream position here, because it's a careful one, not a dismissal. Texts compiled 1,000 years after the fact, by scribes from one regional lineage, were never going to record every power center in the wider landscape. Being left out of the old books isn't proof that a place didn't matter. It's proof of whose story got written down, and by whom centuries later in a different region entirely. Even the closest legendary link anyone has drawn, a loose connection to the Xia dynasty, is treated by archaeologists as unconfirmed. The excavation hasn't settled it either way. That's the responsible answer. It deserves to be said plainly, not brushed aside for drama. But look at what it actually admits. Everything we know about who ruled this city, what they called themselves, what language they spoke, how they saw their place in the world. All of it comes from stone, bone, and jade. None of it comes from a single word the people who lived there ever wrote down. This was one of the largest urban centers on the planet at the time, and its name today is just borrowed from a nearby village. Whoever ruled from that 70-meter platform, history never learned to say their name. Walk along the inner citadel walls, an area archaeologists call Huangchengtai, the Imperial City Terrace, and the stone starts looking back at you. Carved into the facing stones are human and animal faces. These aren't scattered rubble. They were built into the wall on purpose. Some are small, worn down by time. Others are startling. In 2022, archaeologists uncovered a new large stone face on the platform's retaining wall. One face on the western side measures about 80 centimeters long and 50 centimeters high. It wears what looks like a headdress. It's the largest single carved image found at the site, and the excavation team thinks it may represent a specific ruler, not just a generic god. This is where the mainstream reading and the open question really start to pull apart. Let's look at both sides fairly. The cautious view, face motifs, especially wide, staring eyes, show up across many early Chinese Neolithic cultures. Nothing exotic is needed to explain them. Carving a symbolic protector into a wall or a doorway is one of the most common instincts in the ancient world. You see it in Mesopotamian eye idols. You see it in early Mesoamerican masks. Cultures with zero contact reached for the same idea independently again and again. Shared symbols don't need a shared source. The harder question is about style. Some researchers see loose visual links between Shimao's carvings and the jade tradition of Liangzhu, a sophisticated culture that flourished near the Yangtze Delta, over 1,000 kilometers south. Liangzhu had already largely collapsed by the time Shimao's walls went up. If craft knowledge really moved across that distance and time gap, it means long-range contact across Neolithic China on a scale the textbooks don't usually describe. This connection is still debated. It hasn't been settled, but it's a real, live academic question. not something invented for the sake of mystery. What isn't in question is everything else built into these same walls. Shimao had no local source of jade, but plenty of it turns up here, meaning it was imported from far away. Carbon dating from samples processed in 2019 places the core construction between roughly 2200 and 1900 BCE. This wasn't an isolated hilltop settlement, improvising its own symbols in a vacuum. It was a city with the labor, the reach, and the trade connections to pull rare stone from 1,000 miles off and carve it into a face that has outlasted its own name. And underneath those same watching walls, archaeologists found something much harder to look at. The main entrance to Shimao's outer wall is called the East Gate. It sits at the highest point of the entire site, with sweeping views over the valley. Of everything at Shimao, this gate was the most heavily defended, and the most ceremonially important. It's a sophisticated defense system: baffled entrances, gate towers, bastions, corner towers, with a main gate decorated in painted murals. It's also where archaeologists found the pits. Above them stand stone monuments carved with watching eyes. Nearby stones are covered in thousands of fragments of fine jade. And beneath the gate itself, dozens of human skulls. The excavation team's finding is stark. Every identified victim was a teenage girl. Archaeologists believe they were sacrificed during the city's founding ceremony. Other reporting confirms it. Many skulls were found specifically under the city gate, consistent with ritual killing tied to construction. The formal excavation summary is direct. Shimao functioned as a regional center of both politics and ritual. The evidence includes human sacrifice performed before the fortification was even built, alongside the jade, early bronze work, and the painted murals at the gate. We should be careful here. It would be easy to sensationalize this. But foundation sacrifice tied to major construction shows up at other sites from this period, in this wider region. It's a known, if grim, pattern in how early states formed. It's not unique to Shimao. The mainstream reading is this: a group capable of building a 5-kilometer wall, a 70-meter platform, and a trade network reaching 1,000 miles for raw jade. That same group had the authority to demand human life as a ritual offering. Maybe at the city's founding. Maybe during a later crisis. What we still don't know, and what ongoing isotope and genetic testing is trying to answer, is who these young women actually were. Local residents, drawn into a ceremony that consumed them? Captives, brought in specifically for this purpose? Members of a rival group, defeated and repurposed as an offering for the very walls meant to keep such groups out? It would be easy to treat Shimao as one impossible city standing alone on an empty steppe. It wasn't. And this is where the real story gets stranger than anything invented, because every time archaeologists dig deeper, the picture keeps growing. Shimao is just one of more than 70 Stone Age settlements found across the same region of Shaanxi. More than 70 stone towns from the same Longshan period horizon have now been uncovered across a huge stretch of territory, from the Altai steppe in the north, all the way to coastal regions near the Yellow Sea. Shimao was clearly trading and exchanging ideas across this entire network. It wasn't isolated at all. Sit with that for a second. It flips the picture most of us carry of ancient China. The textbook version usually starts with one tight core along the central Yellow River, slowly expanding outward toward the Shang dynasty and the history everyone learns in school. But what these excavations actually reveal is different. A dense, connected frontier world. Dozens of fortified stone settlements, strung across a huge arc of the Lus Plateau, all in contact with each other and with cultures far beyond. And all of this happening centuries before the official start of Chinese civilization most people were taught about. Researchers studying the region don't shy away from that shift. They describe finding an entirely unexpected, complex settlement system on the North Lus Plateau, a region long thought of as nothing more than a frontier of Chinese civilization, not a center of it. That word, frontier, is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Frontier of what exactly? If Shimao and its 70 sister settlements were already thriving here, 5 centuries before the traditional start date of dynastic China, then the center this plateau was supposedly on the edge of might not have existed yet. Not in any meaningful form. The real map of where Chinese civilization began may need to stretch much further outward, and much further back than one river valley allows. And then, within a few centuries of reaching this scale, Shimao goes quiet. The occupation window runs roughly from 2300 to 1800 BCE, about 500 years. That sounds long until you remember what got built in that time. A 5-kilometer wall system, a 70-meter platform, an 80,000 square meter palace, a trade network stretching 1,000 miles, at least 2 waves of ritual killing. All of it, razed and then abandoned, in less time than separates us today from the height of the Roman Empire. There's no single burn layer across the whole site. No sign of a one-day conquest. What the evidence shows instead is a slow decline. A once dominant regional power, gradually losing its people and its influence over generations. Not destroyed in one blow, simply no longer sustained. The leading explanation is environmental. And it's a strong one, backed by regional climate data. Around this period, large parts of Eurasia went through a drying, cooling shift. That same shift has been linked to the decline of other societies too, from the Indus Valley to parts of Mesopotamia. Shimao sat right on the ecological seam between farmland and steppe grassland. That's exactly the kind of place that fails first when the climate turns. The same location that made Shimao a powerful trade hub in good years may be what made it unsustainable when conditions changed. That explanation holds up. It doesn't need to be argued away, but it doesn't answer everything either. Where did the population actually go? Why was a site with this much labor and ritual meaning poured into it never rebuilt at anything close to its old scale? A network this powerful, able to command human sacrifice and 1,000-mile jade shipments, should leave some clear trace of handing off its authority to whatever came next. Did people scatter into the 70 other settlements already dotting the plateau? Did the ruling class move south, closer to the river valleys where the recognized early states eventually rose? Or did the whole symbolic world, the carved eyes, the memory of the city itself, simply stop being carried forward by anyone at all? To understand how strange this silence really is, it helps to place Shimao next to the 2 other giants of prehistoric Chinese archaeology most people have actually heard of. To the south, centuries earlier, the Liangzhu culture near the Yangtze Delta built its own walled towns, its own elite jade tradition, its own layered ritual system. Then it collapsed, its cities abandoned well before Shimao's walls even went up. Centuries later, to the southeast, the site of Erlitou rose along the Yellow River's central stretch. Most mainstream scholars treat Erlitou as the strongest physical candidate yet found for the historical Xia, or at the very least, an early Bronze Age state that led directly into the world the old texts describe. Shimao sits almost exactly between those 2 stories. Too late to be Liangzhu, too early, and too far north to comfortably fit inside Erlitou's narrative. And yet it's bigger than both of them combined in raw scale, bigger fortifications, and just as dramatic evidence of centralized ritual power in the form of the sacrifices at the gate. Of the 3, it's the only one no ancient text seems to know by name. This isn't a suppressed mystery. It's a published, actively debated, completely mainstream one. Chinese archaeologists themselves are the ones asking these questions, in peer-reviewed journals, not on fringe websites. But the honest answer, right now, to who built Shimao, and why doesn't anyone seem to have written it down, is simple. We don't fully know yet. The dig is still active. The testing on the sacrificial remains is still running. The Liangzhu connection is still debated, not resolved. Chapter 7, Masuda. The mainstream position on Masuda is not unreasonable on its face. The monument stands in Osaka, the political center of Japan during the 6th and 7th centuries. Some of the country's most ambitious early construction projects emerged from this region. Massive tombs were built. Temple complexes appeared across the landscape. Large stone monuments were already part of the local tradition. Attributing Masuda to the same period is not a difficult leap. The standard interpretation goes further and proposes that Masuda was either a water basin, a large-scale ritual purification vessel, or a platform for astronomical observation. The 2 rectangular shafts on its top in this reading were channels for water, or possibly sighting grooves for tracking celestial alignments. Some researchers have proposed it is an unfinished component of a larger monument that was simply abandoned in place. These are serious proposals. They deserve serious engagement. But here is exactly where the official story develops a fault line. The Asuka period has left us an extensive material record. We know what Asuka craftsmen built. We have their temples. We have their coffin, the enormous keyhole-shaped burial mounds of the imperial elite. We have detailed records of the labor corvée systems that organized large-scale construction, and we have reasonable estimates of what those systems could move and how. And in none of that record is there any method described that could transport an 800 metric ton monolith across several kilometers of hilly, forested terrain and then dress its surfaces to the tolerances visible on Masuda today. The Asuka builders were capable. Masuda required something more than capable. So who exactly had that capability in the Japanese archipelago? And more importantly, when? This is the point where the timeline begins to come apart. The attribution of Masuda to the Asuka period rests almost entirely on stylistic inference and geographic proximity to other Asuka-era monuments. There is no inscription. There is no contemporary written record that specifically mentions the stone's construction. And there is no organic material directly associated with the carving event that would allow radiometric dating. We should be honest about what that means. Carbon-14 dating, the technique most people associate with archaeological chronology, works by measuring the decay of radioactive carbon in organic material, bone, charcoal, plant fiber. It does not work on stone. You cannot carbon date a rock. The mineral itself carries no radiometric clock that allows us to ask when it was shaped, only when it was formed, which in the case of granite or andesite takes us back hundreds of millions of years, long before any human question becomes relevant. What this means for Masuda is precise and important. The Asuka period attribution is a guess. A reasonable guess, made by credentialed researchers working from the available context. But a guess. The stone could be older, could be significantly older, and there is nothing in the physical record of the object itself that rules that out. Dr. Gina Barnes, a leading scholar of Japanese archaeology, has noted that the Asuka period tends to absorb anomalous monuments by default, meaning that large, undated stonework in the Yamato region is frequently assigned to the 6th or 7th century, simply because that is the most active known construction period in the area. That is a methodological convenience. It is not a proof. The window for Masuda is, in honest terms, open. Set aside the Asuka builders for a moment and ask a different question. In the Japanese archipelago, across its full-known prehistory, who actually demonstrated the ability to work stone at this scale? The answer that keeps surfacing is the Yayoi and, before them, the Jaman. The Jaman people are among the longest-running cultures in the human archaeological record. Their civilization, if that word applies, and many researchers now argue it does, persisted for roughly 14,000 years, from approximately 14,500 BCE through to around 300 BCE. That time span dwarfs every civilization we typically call ancient. Rome lasted about 1,000 years. Egypt's dynastic period ran for 3,000. The Jaman endured for 14 times that. What the Jaman built and used has been systematically underestimated. For most of the 20th century, they were classified as simple hunter-gatherers, and their material culture was treated accordingly. But in the last 3 decades, that picture has been substantially revised. Jaman sites have revealed complex woodworking, deliberate cultivation of plants, sophisticated pottery traditions that are among the oldest in the world, and, crucially, ceremonial stone circle sites that demonstrate a clear and organized relationship with large-scale lithic construction. The site of Oyu stone circles in Akita Prefecture, for example, features 2 concentric stone arrangements built around 2000 BCE. The stones were not local. They were transported deliberately. The astronomical alignments encoded in the rings are real and have been confirmed by modern survey work. The Jaman, in other words, moved and placed significant stones purposefully and over long distances. That is documented. That is not contested. What is unresolved is whether their descendants, or cultures continuous with their tradition, worked stone at the scale and precision evident at Masuda. And the mainstream position, which declines to connect these dots, has not yet produced a better explanation for who else might have. Here is where the Masuda investigation stops being a Japanese story. Stand before the stone and look carefully at its 2 rectangular shafts. They are not decorative. Their edges are clean. Their angles are precise. They are functional forms, cut with clear intent. And the geometry of those cuts, and the overall profile of the monolith itself, begins to rhyme with objects on the other side of the world in ways that demand attention. At Sacsayhuaman, the vast megalithic complex above Cusco in Peru, there are stones of comparable mass, ranging from 100 to 360 metric tons, shaped with a precision that still defies straightforward explanation. The Inca credited with the construction arrived centuries before the Spanish conquest. But beneath Sacsayhuaman, and incorporated into its lowest courses, are stones whose dressing style is measurably different from anything else the Inca produced elsewhere. Researchers, including the late archaeologist John Rowe, noted the stylistic inconsistency in the lower courses decades ago. The question of who made them has not been cleanly answered. Move to the megalithic platform of Baalbek in Lebanon. The three stones in the western retaining wall, called the trilithon, weigh approximately 800 metric tons each. 800. The same order of magnitude as Masuda. They are limestone. They are shaped. They are placed with precision that modern engineers have spent considerable effort trying to reverse engineer. The Romans, who built extensively on the same site, left no record of moving them and demonstrably did not. The stones predate the Roman construction. By how much? No one will say with confidence. 3 sites, 3 different hemispheres, 3 examples of 800 metric ton worked stone for which the credited civilization cannot fully account. The pattern is not conclusive. The honest researcher knows that, but the pattern is there, and it is asking a question that the individual sites examined alone cannot generate by themselves. Return to Masuda itself. Stand on the platform of Masuda itself, which you are permitted to do, and look down into the 2 rectangular shafts. They are 1.8 meters apart, center to center. The internal walls of each shaft are flat and vertical. The corners are clean right angles. The base of each shaft has been worked smooth. If you lower a measuring tape, you find them cut to essentially the same depth, with a deviation of only a few centimeters between the 2. Professor Kazuo Matsumoto, who conducted a detailed structural survey of the monument in the 1990s, noted that the shaft spacing corresponds almost precisely to the width of a standard adult human lying prone, which has led to speculation about their use in mortuary or astronomical ritual contexts. He also noted that the long axis of the stone and the orientation of the shafts is not aligned to any of the major Asuka period temple complexes nearby. It is aligned, within about 2 degrees, to the direction of the midsummer sunrise. Sit with what that means. If the shafts were sighting tubes, oriented not by accident but by design to frame a specific astronomical event, then the object was not just carved. It was calibrated. It required prior knowledge of solar geometry, a fixed observational point, and the engineering precision to translate that knowledge into stone. That is not a simple water basin. That is an instrument, and it raises a question that no current model of Asuka period culture has answered with any satisfaction. Where is the tradition that produced it? But the shafts are only half the story. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of the site found evidence of subsurface anomalies directly beneath the stone, patterned reflections inconsistent with natural bedrock and suggestive of worked or hollow space underneath. The surveys were preliminary. They were not followed up with excavation. The reason given was site preservation. Masuda is a designated cultural property, and invasive investigation is restricted. That caution is real and it is legitimate, but it means that whatever is beneath the rock chip remains unexamined. The Asuka region, it should be noted, is extraordinarily rich in underground construction. The Ishibutai Kofun, located less than 2 kilometers from Masuda, is an enormous granite burial chamber whose capstone weighs 77 metric tons. Underground chambers of dressed stone are not unusual in this landscape. They are, in fact, characteristic of it. What would a chamber beneath Masuda contain? We cannot honestly say, but the pattern of the region, surface monument above, chamber below, astronomical alignment threading between them, is consistent enough to make the question worth asking loudly. The survey equipment has gone quiet. The stone keeps waiting, and it raises a question that no current model of Asuka period culture has answered with any satisfaction. Where is the tradition that produced it? Let us be precise about what the evidence actually shows. 1. Masuda is an 800 metric ton worked monolith in the Yamato heartland of Japan. Its surfaces are dressed. The shafts are geometrically precise. It is not natural. Someone made it. 2. The civilization credited with making it, Asuka period Japan, has left no documented method for moving or shaping stone at this scale, and no contemporary written record of the stone's construction. 3. The stone cannot be directly dated by any radiometric method. The Asuka attribution is inferential, not evidential. 4. The long axis and shaft orientation align within 2 degrees of the midsummer sunrise. This is not consistent with a water basin. It is consistent with an astronomical instrument. 5. Ground-penetrating radar has identified possible subsurface anomalies beneath the stone that have not been excavated or explained. None of this proves a lost civilization. None of this proves an advanced prehistoric technology. The mainstream archaeologists who defend the Asuka attribution are not fools, and their model is internally coherent. It is also doing more explanatory work than each of its steps actually permits. What Masuda asks is a simpler and more uncomfortable question. If we cannot explain how it was made, and we cannot date when it was made, and we cannot agree on what it was for, then on what basis are we certain we know who made it? The stone has been sitting in the same hillside for centuries. Researchers have measured it, surveyed it, compared it to monuments across Japan and beyond. Yet some of the most basic questions remain unresolved. Who built it? What was it for? And why does it refuse to fit comfortably into any explanation proposed so far? Chapter 8. Raqchi. 2 hours south of Cusco, where the Vilcanota River cuts through the high plain toward Lake Titicaca, the land opens into a wide valley ringed by dead volcanic cones. And rising out of the middle of that valley is a single wall, over 90 meters long, running dead straight, taller than almost anything else the Inca ever raised. Here is the detail that stops every visiting engineer in their tracks. The bottom third of that wall is stone, beautifully cut, tightly fitted Inca stonework, the kind you see at Cusco and Ollantaytambo, the kind that has survived earthquakes for 5 centuries without a drop of mortar. And then, right at the point where the stone ends, the material simply changes. Above the stone base, the rest of the wall, more than 15 meters of it, is adobe. Sun-dried mud brick. Think about what that means. The single tallest, longest freestanding wall the Inca ever attempted was built like a layer cake, with the stronger, harder, more expensive material on the bottom and a comparatively soft, crumbling material stacked on top of it for 2/3 of its total height. Every other major Inca structure we know of does the opposite of what common sense would suggest, or simply doesn't mix materials at all. At Sacsayhuaman, at Machu Picchu, at Ollantaytambo, the walls are stone from the ground to the roofline. If adobe appears at all, it is on small domestic structures, not on the largest ceremonial building the empire ever raised. So why here? Why did the builders of the one wall meant to outlast everything else choose to run out of stone 2/3 of the way up and finish the job in mud brick? The standard explanation is straightforward, and we should give it in full. Andesite, the volcanic stone used in the lower courses, had to be quarried and transported and precisely dressed, which takes enormous time and labor. Adobe could be made on site in bulk in a fraction of the time by far less specialized workers. On this reading, the wall isn't a mystery. It's a budget. That explanation is reasonable. It is also strange in a way the textbooks rarely sit with, because this wasn't a storage shed or a worker's house where cutting corners makes sense. Every account we have places this building at the absolute center of the most important religious complex the Inca built along the entire road south out of Cusco. If any wall in the empire was going to get the full stone treatment regardless of cost, it should have been this one. Unless the builders weren't only solving a budget problem. Unless they were solving an engineering problem instead, and that problem has a name. Raqchi sits inside one of the most seismically restless corridors in South America, at the base of a volcanic range that has erupted within human memory. Any structure built to stand here for centuries has to survive earthquakes, not just admire them from a museum plaque. And this is where the stone and adobe design stops looking like a shortcut and starts looking like a calculation. Stone is rigid. It resists small movements beautifully and then fails catastrophically when it's pushed too far, cracking along its joints. Adobe is heavier per layer than you'd expect, but it flexes. It absorbs shock instead of transmitting it in a single hard jolt. Engineers who have surveyed the wall in modern times have pointed out that a stone base carrying an adobe upper structure behaves almost like a tuned system. A heavy, stable foundation that won't shift, topped with a mass that can sway and settle rather than snap. It is not the design of people who ran out of money. It is the design of people who had watched stone buildings fall down before and adobe buildings, battered but standing, still there afterward. We should be fair to the counterargument here, because it deserves to be heard. Critics of this reading point out that we have no Inca engineering treatise, no written record of anyone actually reasoning this way. The seismic design theory is inferred entirely backward from the final shape of the wall, and inference is not the same as proof. That is a fair caution. But notice what it does and does not do. It correctly reminds us we can't read the builder's minds. It does not explain why, out of every possible way to save money on this specific building, they landed on precisely the layered structure that modern seismic engineers now recognize as sound. A coincidence that happens to be structurally brilliant is still worth asking a second question about. And that second question gets harder once you understand what this wall was actually holding up. The wall is not the building. The wall is one half of the spine of a room. On either side of that great central wall, running the entire length of it, the Inca planted 2 long rows of columns, 11 on each side, 22 in total, massive cylindrical stone bases that once carried enormous timber posts rising up to meet a single sloped roof. Put that together and you get something almost nobody expects to find in the Andes. An enclosed hall roughly 25 meters wide and more than 90 meters long, entirely covered by one continuous roof. By floor area, it is considered the largest single roof space the Inca ever built. Larger than anything at Cusco. Larger than anything at Machu Picchu. The local name for the whole complex is the Temple of Huaracocha, after the Inca creator god, and the story tied to the site is specific enough that it reads less like folklore and more like a memory. Spanish chroniclers recorded a local tradition that Huaracocha once passed through this valley in the guise of a poor traveler. The people of the valley, not recognizing him, threw stones and threatened him. In response, the god called down fire from the sky, and the hills themselves are said to have burned. Here's the detail that keeps this from being a throwaway legend. The valley around Raqchi sits directly beneath the Kinshasa volcanic complex, a genuine, geologically active set of cones with documented eruptions in the region's past. A story about a god raining fire down onto this exact valley, told by people who lived beneath an actual volcano, is not obviously invented from nothing. It may be a folk memory of a real eruption, wrapped in the language the culture had for explaining catastrophe. The temple in this reading wasn't just dedicated to Huaracocha in the abstract. It may have been built on the spot where the ground itself was remembered to have caught fire, as a kind of standing apology, which raises an uncomfortable question the mainstream account tends to slide past. If the whole point of the temple was to appease a fire god on the exact ground where fire once fell, why does the site's own final chapter end with fire again? Spanish chronicles and archaeological evidence agree on this much. Sometime around the Spanish conquest, the Great Hall at Raqchi burned. The stone base survived, because stone doesn't burn. The upper adobe walls partially survived, because fired mud brick can take heat. But the roof, the enormous timber and thatch structure that made this the largest covered space in the Inca world, is gone. Today you can stand inside the wall and look straight up at open sky. The conventional explanation is conquest-era destruction, deliberate or incidental, consistent with what happened to sacred Inca buildings across the region during the Spanish campaigns. That is very likely true, and it fits the broader historical record cleanly. But sit with the coincidence for a moment, because it is a real one and it deserves to be named rather than smoothed over. A temple built, according to its own oral tradition, on the site where a god once burned the hillside in anger, ends its own working life in fire. We are not claiming anything mystical here. We are pointing out that the story a culture tells about a place and the actual events that happen to that place sometimes rhyme in ways that are worth sitting with rather than dismissing as pure coincidence. What we can say with more confidence is this: you cannot carbon date a stone wall. The lower courses of andesite at Raqchi carry no organic material and no laboratory test can tell you the year they were cut. Every date attached to the temple's construction, commonly credited to the Inca ruler Huaracocha Inca and expanded under later rulers, comes from indirect evidence. Chronicled histories written down decades after the fact, and organic material like charcoal and roof timber recovered from the burn layer itself. That charcoal can tell us with real confidence when the building burned. It cannot, on its own, tell us with the same confidence exactly when the first stone of that wall was laid. None of this means the standard chronology is wrong. It means the wall's birth date rests on softer evidence than its death date does, and that asymmetry rarely gets mentioned outside specialist literature. While that fire question sits unresolved, there's a second mystery at Raqchi that gets even less attention than the temple itself, and it may be the more important one. Walk out from behind the Great Wall and the landscape changes completely. Spread across the flat ground around the temple are the remains of more than 200 circular stone structures, arranged in orderly rows like a planned neighborhood. These are Khalkha's Inca storehouses, and Raqchi holds one of the largest concentrations of them anywhere in the empire. This is the detail that rarely makes it into the popular telling. Raqchi wasn't only a shrine. It sat directly on the royal road running south out of Cusco toward the Titicaca Basin and the southern provinces. The same route armies, officials, and llama caravans used to move the empire's business. The storehouses here are believed to have held grain and other supplies, positioned exactly where a state moving people and soldiers across hundreds of kilometers of highland terrain would need a reliable place to resupply. Circular construction for grain storage is not an accident of style. A cylindrical building has no corners for moisture and pests to collect in, and it distributes the weight of packed grain evenly against the walls. It is the same logic granaries in entirely unrelated parts of the ancient world converged on independently, from Roman Shoria to storage structures in the American Southwest. Different continents, different centuries, the same physics solving the same problem. Put the temple and the storehouses together and a different picture of Raqchi starts to form. One the mysterious temple framing tends to flatten. This was not an isolated shrine in the mountains. It was a combined religious and logistical hub, sacred ground and state infrastructure occupying the same square kilometer, at a bottleneck on the most important road in the Southern Empire. That combination is the part that has never been fully mapped. Large sections of the surrounding complex, including a walled enclosure believed to have served administrative or residential functions, and the remains of a reservoir near the site, have never received a comprehensive modern excavation. What's visible above ground has been studied. What's still buried in this valley, at one of the busiest crossroads the Inca ever built, largely has not. Stand at the base of that wall at dusk and look at what's actually there. A stone foundation built to survive earthquakes, carrying an adobe upper structure that modern engineers recognize as seismically smarter than solid stone would have been. The largest roofed room the Inca world ever built, standing on a spot the valley's own oral tradition says a god once set on fire. A building whose final chapter was fire as well, for reasons the standard record explains but the coincidence still invites you to sit with. And around it, more than 200 storehouses marking this valley as something closer to a supply hub for an empire than a quiet mountain shrine. A second identity for the site that rarely gets equal billing with the myth. None of this proves the wall is stranger than the textbooks say. What it proves is that a single building can hold an engineering solution modern science is still confirming, a myth that may be a folk memory of a real volcano, and a logistics network that's barely been excavated, and that most retellings only ever pick one of those three stories to tell. So here's the question I actually want an answer to. Was this wall built with mud brick because it was cheaper, or because someone in that valley already understood, without a single written formula, how to build something that could survive the ground moving under it? Tell me what you think in the comments. Don't just repeat what I said. Tell me which part of this you'd have built differently, and why. Chapter 9, Nemrut Dag. Begin with the arithmetic because the arithmetic is where the mystery starts. The artificial mound at the summit of Nemrut Dag contains an estimated 1 million cubic meters of crushed limestone. Not blocks, not slabs, crushed stone. Fragments no larger than a fist, compacted into a pyramid of rubble that has held its shape for more than 2,000 years through earthquakes, ice, and altitude. 1 million cubic meters. To move that material up a mountain at 2,150 meters, with no road, no wheel suited to that gradient, no draft animal capable of that altitude in useful numbers, the labor estimates run into the tens of millions of man-hours. Scholars who have studied the construction logistics describe it, in careful academic language, as one of the most ambitious earthworks undertaken in the ancient world. The mainstream explanation is straightforward and we should give it its full weight. The kingdom of Commagene was, in the 1st century BC, a prosperous buffer state between Rome and Parthia. Its king, Antiochus I, was enormously wealthy, collecting tribute from two rival superpowers simultaneously while maintaining independence from both. He had the resources. He had the motive, the creation of a monument to his own divinity. He had the labor force. Given enough years, a king with unlimited resources can pile 1 million cubic meters of stone on a mountain. That explanation holds. It is internally consistent, but it raises, rather than answers, the central question. Because a king wealthy enough to build this mountain was also wise enough to know one thing. Tombs get robbed. Every royal tomb in the ancient world that could be found was found. Egypt's pharaohs built the most visible monuments in human history, and every single one was plundered in antiquity. The kings of Lydia built tumuli the size of hills, opened. The royal graves of Macedon opened. The tombs of kings who spent fortunes on false passages, hidden chambers, and stone portcullises opened. Antiochus knew this. He was a man of extraordinary education, a student of Greek philosophy, a synthesizer of two of the ancient world's most sophisticated civilizations. He did not pile 1 million cubic meters of stone on a mountain without thinking about what he was protecting. So the question the arithmetic actually asks is not, how did he build it? The question is, did it work? Most ancient rulers leave us to guess at their intentions. Antiochus left us an inscription, cut into stone slabs and placed at multiple locations around the monument. The nomos, the law of the sanctuary, is one of the longest royal inscriptions to survive from the ancient world. Antiochus tells us, in his own words, exactly what this mountain was for. He describes himself as a king of equal Macedonian and Persian descent. He names the gods depicted in the giant statues. Antiochus himself, enthroned as a deity, flanked by Apollo Mithras, Zeus Oromasdes, Hercules Artanias, and the goddess Commagene. He prescribes the exact festivals to be celebrated here, twice yearly, on his birthday and his coronation day. He orders the fires to be lit, the sacrifices performed, the priests maintained in perpetuity. And then he says something that has driven archaeologists to this mountain for more than a century. He describes his own tomb. He states that his body rests in a sacred place, a familio, a foundation, in proximity to the gods whose images surround the mound. He frames the tomb not as a hiding place, but as a meeting point, the place where Antiochus, having achieved divine status in life, completes his merger with the gods in death. The inscription does not say precisely where inside or beneath the mound the body lies, but it does something more useful for our purposes. It tells us Antiochus regarded the entire monument as a working system. The statues are not decoration. The ceremonies are not optional. The fires, the priests, the festivals, all of it is the mechanism by which the king's memory and his divine status are maintained. This is the first piece of evidence that changes how we read the mound. The mainstream interpretation presents Nemrut Dag as a monument to royal vanity, an ego project of a minor king in a minor kingdom. And there is truth in that framing. But the inscription reveals something more precise. Antiochus was not simply building a large tomb. He was building a system, a monument designed not merely to contain his remains but to make those remains permanently inaccessible. Not through a single stone door, but through the accumulated mass of a mountain that no one would ever be able to search efficiently. He wanted his body found at the right hand of the gods, not by grave robbers with torches. The mound is not the grave marker. The mound may be the defense. In 1882, a German engineer named Karl Sester arrived at Nemrut Dag for the Ottoman government. He was not looking for a mystery. He was surveying roads. He looked up at the summit, saw the giant heads, and understood immediately that he was standing at something extraordinary. He reported his discovery to the German Archaeological Institute. 2 years later, the archaeologist Otto Puckstein arrived to conduct the first systematic survey. Puckstein studied the monument, read the inscription, and reached a conclusion that has guided every subsequent search. The tomb is inside the mound. This is not speculation. It is the logical reading of everything Antiochus left behind. The statues face the mound. The inscription places the burial near the gods. The entire monument is oriented around the artificial peak at its center. A king who built this structure as a tomb protection system would not bury himself at the foot of the hill or in a cave on the slope. He would place himself at the center of the system, under the mound or within it. The corollary is equally logical. If the tomb is inside the mound, finding it should simply be a matter of excavating the mound. And here is where the investigation enters its first silence. Puckstein could not excavate. The mound was too large, the technology too limited, the site too remote. He left the question open. It would stay open for another 70 years. In the 1950s and 60s, serious systematic archaeology came to Nemrut Dag. The American School of Oriental Research funded expeditions. Turkish authorities participated. Scholars arrived with the methods and the mandate to finally resolve the question Puckstein had left standing. They dug, not randomly, systematically, guided by the inscription, guided by the logic of the monument's design, guided by the assumption that a tomb of this scale would leave structural signatures. A shaft, a chamber wall, a change in the composition of the rubble that would indicate human construction beneath the fill. They found nothing. No architectural evidence of anything beneath the mound other than more broken limestone. The same crushed stone, compacted, indistinguishable layer after layer, all the way down to the natural bedrock of the peak. The excavations were stopped. The mound was too large to excavate by conventional means. The cost would have been extraordinary and the risk of destabilizing the monument, including the statues, was real. A more targeted approach would be needed. That approach came in 2001. A Turkish-American research team applied seismic tomography to the mound, the same technology used to image the interior of the Earth itself, translated to the scale of an archaeological earthwork. Sound waves sent through the mound, their reflections mapped and analyzed, producing a three-dimensional picture of what lay inside. The results were promising. The seismic data appeared to show anomalies, regions within the mound where the density of the rubble changed, where something different might lie beneath the surface. The team identified what they believed could be a chamber at depth, below the main mass of crushed stone. They announced the finding cautiously. They recommended targeted excavation to follow up. That excavation did not happen. Turkish authorities, responsible for a UNESCO World Heritage Site of extraordinary fragility, declined to permit invasive work on the basis of preliminary seismic data alone. The anomalies remain anomalies. The mound remains unbroken. And here the investigation hits a wall that is not made of stone. The wall is made of institutional caution, which is entirely reasonable, which is entirely correct given what is at stake, and which has the same practical effect on our question as 2,000 years of unbroken rubble. No confirmed chamber, no confirmed entrance, no verified access route. After more than a century of searching, we are still outside. If we cannot yet enter the mound, we can read what surrounds it. The monument at Nemrut Dag is not simply a hill with some statues. It is a precisely engineered ceremonial complex covering the entire summit of the mountain, and the more carefully you study its design, the more deliberate the logic of concealment becomes. There are two terraces, east and west, cut into the slope below the mound. Each terrace carries its own row of statues, its own inscriptions, its own fire altar. The statues on both terraces are arranged identically. This is not redundancy. It is a statement about orientation. East and west, sunrise and sunset. The terraces were built to be used, liturgically, ceremonially, at both ends of the day. The inscription tells us when. The fires burned at dawn and at dusk. Priests maintained the sanctuary in perpetuity. Antiochus was not building a tomb in the way we normally understand tombs. He was building a working temple around a tomb. The visibility of the monument is not a security flaw. It is the point. This is where the mainstream interpretation and the investigative reading diverge most sharply. The standard framing presents the monument as vanity, a small king making himself large. And the statues, the inscription, the theatrical scale, all of that supports the vanity reading. But consider the engineering from the tomb protection perspective. Grave robbers in the ancient world operated under cover of absence. They worked on tombs that had been abandoned, whose priests had scattered, whose locations had faded from living memory. The great royal tombs of Egypt were breached not by frontal assault but by slow infiltration. Priests who knew the layout, workmen who remembered the passages, local knowledge passed down over generations until someone finally acted on it. Antiochus designed against this specific failure mode. The monument is not hidden. cannot be forgotten. It sits on the highest visible point for 200 kilometers. You cannot approach the region without knowing it is there. The inscription is public, permanent, and in 2 languages, Greek and Armenian, so that no population within reach could claim ignorance. The fires were to be maintained forever, not metaphorically forever, and then the kingdom ended. Commagene was absorbed into the Roman Empire in 72 AD, less than 100 years after Antiochus built his mountain. The priests dispersed, the endowment dissolved, the ceremonies stopped. The system Antiochus built to protect his tomb by keeping it permanently inhabited failed. And yet, and this is the fact that closes every argument, the tomb has still not been found. Stand at the summit of Nemrut Dag at dusk and count what the evidence has given us. A king who told us exactly where he was buried and exactly why he was buried there. A monument whose logic, once you read the inscription, is entirely coherent as a tomb protection system rather than merely a vanity project. A century of systematic searching, excavation, seismic imaging, ground-penetrating radar that has produced promising anomalies and no confirmed chamber. A system designed to be maintained forever that collapsed within a century of its completion. And yet, 2,000 years later, the tomb has not been found. The heads lie in pieces. The fires have been cold for 2 millennia. The priests are gone. The kingdom is gone. The festivals Antiochus ordered to be maintained forever were abandoned long before Rome fell. The system failed. And the tomb somehow is still there, which leaves the investigation with a question it cannot answer, but cannot stop asking. Did Antiochus succeed in spite of the failure of his system? Or did he succeed because of it? Because here is what the mound may actually be. Not a monument around a tomb. A tomb disguised as a monument. Antiochus could not have known about seismic tomography, but he understood, with the precision of a man who had studied the failure modes of every royal tomb before his, that the perfect defense was not a locked door. The perfect defense was a mound of 1 million cubic meters of broken stone that looked exactly like a locked door without actually being one. The heads are still staring across the plateau. The fires have been cold for 2,000 years. A king is still waiting to be found. Whether he ever will be depends on a question archaeology is still arguing about. Not where the tomb is, whether breaking the mountain to find it is a price worth paying. Antiochus, in his inscription, would say no. The mountain is the answer. The mountain was always the answer.